What would you do if you came face to face with the divine? What would you say if you met Jesus? How would it change you? Julian Ramirez faced exactly that. A taxi driver, exhausted from life's demands, pushing himself to the breaking point for his family. Then one night, everything changed. In a moment between life and death, he encountered something that no doctor could explain, no skeptic could deny. Something that would transform. You've ever felt the presence of God, but challenge everyone around something you couldn't explain, or wondered if miracles are real? Subscribe now. This channel is dedicated to stories of divine intervention, spiritual awakening, and encounters that defy all logic. Subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because some stories are too powerful not to share, and some encounters are too real to ignore. The constant sound of monitors filled the intensive care unit of Houston General Hospital. The air smelled of disinfectant and medications, a mixture that for many meant suffering and hope at the same time. In one of the beds, surrounded by tubes, bandages, and machines, a man with a tired face and grown-out beard began to slowly move his fingers. It was Julian Ramirez, a 42-year-old taxi driver who had spent weeks in a coma after a brutal accident on the highway to San Antonio. No one expected him to open his eyes that cloudy morning. Suddenly, his breathing accelerated, his eyelids trembled, and as if an invisible force was pushing him back to life, Julian opened his eyes. And nurses ran toward him in disbelief, while his weak body tried to adjust once again to the weight of the world. His cracked lips moved with difficulty, barely letting a murmur escape. A nurse leaned down to listen better and heard him say with a broken voice, "I saw Jesus." The words echoed in the room like an anthem. Impossible echo. One of the nurses crossed herself immediately. Another frowned with disbelief. No one knew what to think. That man who had been hovering between life and death now awakened, claiming to have seen the Savior. Before we continue with this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single detail of what happened in Julian's life after this moment that changed everything. His mind was still clouded, and the white light of the hospital blinded him. But inside him burned the certainty of what he had lived. These weren't dreams or fuzzy shadows. He had been in a different place, a place that looked nothing like anything he knew. The memories of that experience began to blend with reality, and although his voice was weak, his eyes transmitted unexpected firmness. Dr. Hernandez, on duty that morning, rushed in after the nurse's alert. He quickly checked vital signs, surprised that the patient had regained consciousness. With a professional tone, he asked, "Mr. Ramirez, can you hear me? Do you know where you are?" Julian barely nodded. His throat was burning, and speaking was painful effort. Still, he found the strength to repeat, "I saw Jesus. He told me I had to come back." The doctor fell silent for a few seconds, unsure how to react. He made a note in the file, marking his awakening as an extraordinary clinical fact, but avoided commenting on what he'd said. However, the nurses couldn't stop looking at him with a mixture of fear and admiration. Far from the room, in the waiting area, Maria Gonzalez, his wife, had spent entire nights without sleep. She had prayed every day in front of a small image of the Virgin of Zapopan, which she kept in her purse, asking for a miracle. When they called to inform her that Julian had awakened, her legs could barely support her. She rushed into the room, and seeing him open his eyes, she bent over him with tears streaming down her face. "Julian," she exclaimed with a choked sigh. "I thought you weren't coming back." He tried to smile, though he could barely move his lips. His gaze, however, shone with an intensity Maria had never seen before. "Maria, I saw him. He was there. Jesus spoke to me." She took his hand firmly, as if afraid of losing him again. She didn't know whether to believe him, but in that instant, all that mattered was that her husband was alive. The atmosphere in the room changed. What for doctors was merely a clinical awakening for the family became a sign of hope, and for Julian the beginning of a mystery that would accompany him forever. His body was weak, his wounds still open, but inside him was something new, something that couldn't be explained with simple words. Silence returned to reign in the room, interrupted only by the beeping of machines. However, in Julian's heart, a certainty burned with force. That experience had not been a dream, and soon he would discover that his life would never be the same again. Before that silence in the hospital became his world, Julian Ramirez's life was marked by the constant noise of engines, the bustle of the streets of Houston, and the rush of each day at the wheel of his taxi. His routine began very early, when the sky wasn't yet light, and the cold air of early morning mixed with the smell of sweet bread. Escaping from bakeries open since 5 a.m., he would start his old Nissan sedan, listen to the radio with the day's news, and prepare to traverse endless avenues like Bel Air, Richmond, or Westheimer. The streets were his daily stage, and although he knew every pothole and every dangerous corner, he never stopped feeling the pressure of bills to pay. At home, his family waited for him. Maria Gonzalez, his wife of many years, a firm and patient woman who managed to balance what little came into the household. Diego, 16, dreamed of studying engineering, but was already thinking about working so as not to be a burden. Sophia, 13, with easy laughter and curious eyes, still held the innocence of early adolescence. The nights were usually the only moment they could sit together around the table. While eating refried beans, warm tortillas, and sometimes a piece of meat if the day had gone well, they talked about daily problems. Maria didn't hide her worry. "Julian, you look tired. How long do you plan to drive these hours?" She'd ask in a sweet but firm tone. He'd smile, though his eyes betrayed the weight of exhaustion. "Until I can rest, Maria. There's no other way. The kids need to keep going to school." The effort consumed him. There were days when he barely managed to sleep 4 hours, and his body resented every sleepless night. However, he never allowed himself to show weakness in front of his children. They saw him as a pillar, and he didn't want that image to crack. In the midst of that exhausting routine, there was a space that gave them a respite, the parish of the neighborhood. There, under the care of Father Ignacio, a man with a serene voice and approachable character, they found spiritual comfort. Julian wasn't a man of constant prayers, but he accompanied Maria when he could, more to see her at peace than out of conviction. The priest had noticed the wear in his eyes. One afternoon, while Julian waited for Maria after Mass, Father approached him. "Son, you can't live carrying everything alone. Sometimes it's necessary to stop," he said. Julian looked down and answered with a hint of irony. "If I stop, Father, we don't eat." "That simple," Ignacio sighed, understanding that his words couldn't erase the difficulties of a man living day to day. The city itself seemed to conspire against his peace. Endless traffic, impatient passengers, the risks of driving at night in dangerous areas. Each day was a test of endurance. He'd already had several close calls on the road, flat tires, cars crossing without looking, drunk drivers, and yet he never thought of stopping. Maria, in silence, carried her own battles. She sold food, too. Neighbors, when she could, took care of the kids, performed miracles with money. And when accounts didn't add up, she prayed harder. In the days before the accident, Julian was especially exhausted. He'd taken double shifts to save money for Diego and Sophia's school enrollment. His body was sending him signals, constant back pain, heavy eyelids, a bothersome ringing in his head. But he remained convinced that his duty as a father was greater than any discomfort. That night, before leaving to work, Maria looked at him firmly. "Promise me you'll rest a little, Julian. I'm asking you from my heart." He kissed her forehead, and with a smile that hid his fatigue, answered, "Tomorrow I will. I promise you. Just one more run today." Maria didn't insist, but deep down she felt a strange knot in her stomach, as if something dark was approaching. What Julian didn't know was that that seemingly innocent decision would be the prelude to the moment that would mark his life forever. Night fell over Texas with light rain that soaked the streets and darkened the horizon. Julian, gripping the steering wheel of his old sedan, felt exhaustion weighing on his eyelids. The windshield barely maintained visibility with the rhythmic swish of wipers, while the highway to San Antonio stretched like an endless snake, illuminated only by scattered headlights from cargo trucks. He'd accepted that ride because the client paid well, and with that money, he could cover part of Sophia's school supplies. Although he knew that driving at night in the rain was dangerous, the economic pressure was stronger than his instinct for caution. The roar of trailers echoed every time they passed alongside him. Julian tried to stay focused, but exhaustion hit hard. He pinched his legs, opened the window to let cold air keep him awake, and yet sleep ambushed him little by little. One more run, just one, he murmured to encourage himself, while remembering his children's faces. The road was in poor condition. Deep puddles hid potholes, and some stretches lacked public lighting. Julian knew that route and knew it had been the scene of many accidents, but he never imagined he'd become part of the statistics that night. A few meters ahead, a loaded trailer carrying tons of merchandise began changing lanes without warning. The wet road gleamed like a mirror, and the glare of lights confused Julian's vision. He honked desperately, but his vehicle was too small for the massive metal truck driver to notice. Immediately, in a matter of seconds, tragedy unfolded. The sedan skidded on the slippery asphalt. Julian tried to turn the wheel with all his might, but the car lost control. A dull crash shook his body when the front impacted the side of the trailer. The sound of twisting metal mixed with the explosion of glass, and everything became confusion. The world spun. The lights of the headlights blended with darkness. Julian felt pain pierce his body as the seatbelt cut across his chest. His breathing became a brief, agonizing gasp. For an instant, everything fell silent. He only heard the rain hitting the crumpled roof of the car and the distant echo of horns from other drivers trying to avoid the accident. A man got out of his truck and ran toward the destroyed vehicle. He hit the window desperately. "Brother, hold on. We already called the ambulance," he shouted with a trembling voice. Julian could barely move his head. His eyes were closing slowly, but in his mind appeared images of Maria, Diego, Sophia. The thought of leaving them alone shook him more than the physical pain. "My children," he whispered with barely a voice. The stranger tried to calm him, but time seemed to be working against them. The ambulance was delayed, caught in traffic generated on the highway. Meanwhile, Julian struggled to stay awake. The cold of the night wrapped around him, and he felt that each breath could be the last. When the paramedics finally arrived, the scene was desolate. They carefully removed Julian from the twisted metal, placed him on a stretcher, and immediately connected him to oxygen. His vital signs were weak, but there was still hope. "He's critical, but breathing," said one of them, trying to give encouragement. The ambulance siren cut through the night's silence as it raced toward the hospital. Inside, Julian wavered between consciousness and unconsciousness. His body was destroyed, and his mind was about to shut down. While the city slept, a man struggled not to be, devoured by darkness. The accident had left him on the brink of death, and no one could assure him whether he'd see daylight again. Houston General Hospital was saturated that night. The wail of sirens and the constant movement of stretchers showed a system struggling between lack of resources and the urgency of saving lives. When the ambulance carrying Julian Ramirez arrived at the emergency entrance, the medical team hurried to receive him. The crash had left his body in critical condition: fractured ribs, deep wounds, internal bleeding. They immediately connected him to assisted respiration and multiple monitors. Doctors worked against the clock, between quick orders and precise maneuvers. Julian's heart resisted, but they finally managed to stabilize him, though his consciousness faded completely. From that moment, his life hung suspended in absolute silence. He didn't wake up, didn't respond, and each day that passed without opening his eyes increased his family's anguish. In the waiting area, Maria Gonzalez clutched the small image of the Virgin of Zapopan, which she always carried in her purse. She had arrived running with red eyes and an aching heart. She asked every doctor who came out for news of her husband, but the answers were always the same. He's critical. We can only wait. Time seemed not to advance. Maria spent the nights on a hard bench, accompanied by other women from the parish who came to encourage her. Among them, Mrs. Lepida, a neighbor from the neighborhood, offered her hot coffee and words of comfort. "Have faith, my child. God doesn't abandon," she repeated while caressing her shoulder. Father Ignacio also visited several times. He entered with measured steps, carrying a small rosary. He approached Maria and with a serene voice said, "Your prayer is not in vain. God hears even in the longest silences." Inside the intensive care unit, the atmosphere was very different. The hum of machines and the constant beeping of monitors had become the only voice accompanying Julian. His body remained motionless, sustained by tubes and needles. Although his eyes were closed, deep in his mind something was happening. Within him there was no time, no sun or moon, only a vast darkness that wrapped around him completely. It was like floating in a boundless space, without recognizable sounds, barely a distant murmur that sometimes confused itself with familiar voices. At times he believed he heard Maria calling him. Other times he swore he perceived Sophia crying. Those voices seemed to come from an endless tunnel, always distant, always fuzzy. Fear mixed with a strange peace. Julian felt he was trapped between two worlds, as if something kept him suspended. He tried to move, to scream, but his body didn't respond. In that void, he learned to listen, and amid nothingness, silence had an unbearable weight. Meanwhile, his family dealt with the harshest reality, uncertainty. Doctors explained that he could be in a coma for days, weeks, even months, and no one could guarantee how he'd wake up. Diego, his oldest son, listened to those words with a hardened face, as if trying to be strong for everyone. However, when left alone, he broke down in tears. "Dad, hold on. Don't leave us," he murmured in a low voice, pressing his forehead against the cold hospital wall. The passage of days left marks. Maria barely ate. Sophia slept in an uncomfortable chair, and faith was all that kept them together. Each prayer, each tear, each visit from Father Ignacio became a small beacon amid the storm. And while outside, life continued with its chaotic city rhythm, inside Julian continued to exist in that thick silence, that invisible boundary separating life from death. A boundary that still hadn't decided to open for either side, but something in the deepest part of his being was beginning to take shape. In the midst of that endless silence, something began to change inside Julian. The darkness that wrapped around him began to slowly dissolve, as if a distant light was breaking through the fog. At first, he thought it was a fleeting glimpse produced by his mind's fatigue, but soon he understood that it was different. The glow became increasingly intense, enveloping him with warmth that contrasted with the cold he felt in his motionless body. He wasn't in pain in that place, nor anguish, only a profound peace that made him forget for moments the accident, the hospital, his family's struggle. He walked, or at least felt he did, along a wide path surrounded by fields of maguey that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was filled with the aroma of wet earth, as real as the rainy days in Texas. On the side of the road, thousands of orange flowers bloomed with an intense color, as if light itself emanated from them. Julian looked at them in amazement. They reminded him of Dia de Muertos, the altars his mother used to set up in the house when he was a child. The place had something profoundly familiar, as if linked to his own history and the culture that had accompanied him since always. Suddenly, in the distance, he distinguished a figure. It was a man dressed in a white tunic, whose steps left no dust. Light seemed to emanate from his own being, and his face, though simple, transmitted a serenity that was overwhelming. Julian stopped. His heart, or whatever gave him life in that space, began to beat with force. Who are you?" he asked with a trembling voice. The man smiled with sweetness, and his eyes reflected immense compassion. "I am the one who has always walked at your side," he answered with a voice that was firm yet soft, as if all the words in the world condensed in that instant. Julian fell to his knees, unable to stand before that presence. Tears began to stream down his face. He didn't need him to name himself. Inside, he knew with certainty that he was facing Jesus. Fear invaded him first. He remembered his mistakes, his debts, the times he'd lost patience with his children, the nights when he doubted Maria's faith. He felt unworthy of being there. But Jesus approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your time hasn't ended," he said with a calm that pierced his soul. "Go back and care for what you love." The words enveloped him like an embrace. Julian wanted to respond, wanted to beg to stay in that place where everything was peace, but his voice broke. "Why me? Why do you let me go back?" he asked between sobs. Jesus looked at him with tenderness. "Because your life still has purpose. There are those who need you more than you imagine." At that moment, Julian felt a mixture of gratitude and confusion. The path of maguey and flowers began to fade little by little, as if the wind carried the vision away. The glow was still there, but increasingly distant. He tried to hold on, reaching out like a child who doesn't want to let go of his father's embrace. "Don't leave me," he cried desperately. Jesus, before completely fading, spoke a final phrase. "Trust, you are not alone." Suddenly, peace transformed into a void. The warmth faded and the silence returned around him, heavy and dark. Julian felt he was being pulled downward, as if falling into an invisible abyss. His heart beat with violence, and an unknown force pushed him toward the edge of consciousness. The last thing engraved in his mind was that clear voice, that promise that seemed tattooed in the deepest part of his being. He didn't know if he'd ever hear it again, but in that instant he understood that something in his life would never be the same. The cardiac monitor emitted its constant beeping when suddenly Julian Ramirez's eyes began to open. At first, the white light of the hospital blinded him, forcing him to blink several times. His lungs struggled to adapt to the rhythm of assisted breathing, and a sharp pain ran through his entire body as a reminder of the accident. Still, he was conscious. He had come back. The nurse watching him let out a choked cry. "Doctor, he's waking up." Within seconds, 2 doctors and another nurse rushed in. They checked his vital signs, adjusted machines, and surrounded him with a mixture of surprise and caution. Dr. Hernandez, with an incredulous expression, leaned toward him. "Mr. Ramirez, can you hear me?" "Try to say something." Julian opened his mouth with difficulty. His dry lips could barely articulate words, but a murmur came from deep within his being. "I saw Jesus." Silence took over the room. One of the nurses crossed herself immediately. Another looked down to hide the confusion in her face. The doctor, meanwhile, tried to maintain calm. "What's important is that you're conscious," he answered in a clinical tone while making notes in the file. "Your recovery will be complicated, but this is progress." Julian wanted to insist, but the pain in his chest forced him to close his eyes for a moment. His mind, however, was clear. It hadn't been a dream. The vision remained so vivid in him that he couldn't keep quiet about it. Minutes later, Maria rushed in. Her heart beat so hard she could barely breathe. When she saw his eyes open, she ran to the bed and took his hand in hers. "Julian," she exclaimed with tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought I'd never see you like this again." He looked at her with tenderness, though his voice came out weak, almost broken. "Maria, I saw him. Jesus was there. He told me to come back." She embraced him carefully, afraid of hurting him. Her heart wavered between gratitude for having him back and the uncertainty of what she was hearing. "Thank you, God. Thank you for giving my husband back to me," she whispered without stopping crying. Soon his children entered. Diego, with his face hardened by worry, approached slowly, trying to be strong. Sophia, on the other hand, couldn't hold back and broke down in tears the moment she saw her father. "Dad, I thought you weren't going to wake up," said the girl, hugging the bed. Julian, with painful effort, caressed her hair. "I'm here, daughter, and I'm not giving up." Emotion filled the room, but outside the family, the atmosphere was different. Some doctors commented in low voices, attributing his words to delirium from waking after a coma. For them, it made more sense to think of a hallucination caused by hypoxia or medications. Dr. Hernandez, while reviewing the file, commented to a colleague, "It's normal. Many patients report visions. What matters is his physical recovery." But although doctors sought scientific explanations, in Julian there was an unshakable conviction. What he had seen was not the product of a confused mind. It had been real. And that certainty filled him with an energy that surprised even amid the pain. The news of Julian's awakening began to spread through the hospital corridors and reach the streets of Houston. First, it was a rumor among nurses and paramedics. Then someone mentioned it at the parish, and soon the story spread from mouth to mouth. The taxi driver assures he saw Jesus while in a coma. Neighbors began approaching the hospital, some with flowers, others with simple words of encouragement. His room in intermediate care, where they now kept him under observation, became a place of constant visits. There were those who entered with genuine faith, convinced that Julian was witness to a miracle. But there were also curious people who looked at him as if he were a rarity. An elderly man, Don Evaristo, bent toward him and said with solemnity, "My son, you are proof that the Lord doesn't abandon us. Tell what you saw. Don't keep it to yourself." Julian smiled with effort, grateful for that man's faith. But not everyone shared the same vision. One afternoon, while conversing with Maria, he overheard two young people in the hallway mocking him. Bet he was drugged with all that medicine and made up his story. Yeah, they say he even saw flowers and voices. What a crazy guy. Julian closed his eyes with contained rage. Maria caressed his hand. Don't pay attention. There will always be those who doubt. However, what hurt him most was the impact the story began to have on his children. Sophia in middle school became the target of cruel bullying. One day she arrived at the hospital with red eyes from crying so much. "Dad, they tell me you're a crazy man who made up Jesus to get attention," she confessed with a broken voice. Julian felt a knot in his throat. He wanted to get up from the bed, protect her, but he could barely move his legs without pain. He looked at her firmly and spoke with the greatest firmness he could muster. "Daughter, don't let those words hurt you. I know what I saw, and even if no one else believes it, I'll carry it with me until the end." She hugged him tightly, seeking in that contact the security that the outside world denied her. Diego reacted differently. His reserved character led him to face the situation in silence, but inside him burned a deep rage. One night, when alone with his father, he said quietly, "If what you saw is true, you have to prove it. You can't just say it and leave us all looking crazy." Julian listened with patience, understanding that his son's words were born from helplessness. "It's not up to me to convince the world, Diego. I can only tell what I lived." The rest is not in my hands. The attention wasn't limited to family. In the neighborhood, opinions were divided. Some considered him chosen. Others assured it was a hoax. Social media of the community filled with comments. What a coincidence. Now everyone sees Jesus when they have an accident. Someone wrote in a neighborhood group, "I know him. He's a hard-working and honest man. Why wouldn't we believe him?" Answered another person. In the midst of that whirlwind, Father Ignacio visited the family again. He carried with him a calm that seemed unshakable. "Son, remember that prophets were also rejected. Faith makes people uncomfortable, and that's fine. Your mission is not that everyone believes you, but to stay faithful to what you lived." Julian clung to the priest's words. He knew he couldn't control what people said about him, but he could control how he faced it. That night, while listening to the murmur of voices in the hospital corridors, he understood that his life was no longer private. Whether he liked it or not, the community had placed him at the center of a conversation that surpassed him. The most difficult part was still to come. The nights in the hospital had become more unsettling than the days. When the bustle of nurses and paramedics faded, when the smell of freshly applied chlorine hung suspended in the corridors, and only the monotonous beeping of machines remained, Julian entered a different territory, that of his thoughts. He'd close his eyes, and instead of resting, fleeting images of what he'd lived during the coma would appear. They weren't loose memories. They were visions that returned with an impossibility of ignoring their clarity. Sometimes he saw the path of Magway illuminated by warm radiance. Other times he heard clearly the voice that had told him, "Your time hasn't ended. Go back and care for what you love." At first, he thought it was memory repeating what he'd already lived, but soon he began to feel something more, a presence, as if that voice hadn't stayed in that other place, but had come back with him. "I'm not crazy," he whispered in the darkness, trying to convince himself. One early morning, he woke with an agitated heart. He had heard, as clear as soft thunder, a phrase that shook him. Trust. He sat up with difficulty, sweat dripping down his forehead. Maria, who was sleeping in the chair beside the bed, woke up startled. "What's wrong, Julian? Does it hurt?" He shook his head, still trembling. "I heard the voice again." "Maria, it's here with me." She looked at him with a mixture of tenderness and fear. "Love, you need to rest. Maybe your mind is playing tricks on you." "No, Maria, it's not a trick. It's here." She said nothing. She didn't want to contradict him, but her concern was evident in her eyes. During the day, the visions weren't as clear, but his dreams pursued him. Every time he closed his eyes, he walked again along that path of flowers. The voice repeated different phrases to him. Forgive, love more, don't waste your time. They were like fragments of a larger message he couldn't fully understand. In one of Father Ignacio's visits, he found Julian distracted, with his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "What worries you, son?" asked the priest, sitting beside him. "Father, the voice doesn't leave me alone. It wasn't just during the coma. I keep hearing it." The priest observed him seriously. "And what does it say to you?" "It talks about trusting, about caring for mine, about not wasting time, but I don't know what it means." "It's a mandate, a burden." Ignacio breathed deeply before responding. "Maybe it's not a burden, but a guide. The question isn't why, me, but what will I do with this?" Julian fell silent. That doubt tormented him. Would he continue his life as before, returning to the taxi, repeating routines until the body couldn't anymore? Or should he change everything and seek a different purpose? Conversations with his family also showed the tension. One afternoon, while Sophia showed him homework she'd done, Julian watched her in silence. The girl noticed the intensity in his eyes. "Why do you look at me like that, Dad?" "Because I think about what I must do for you. I can't fail you again." She frowned. "You didn't fail us. You had an accident." "No, daughter. I was careless, and God gave me back for a reason. The weight of that reason crushed him as much as it lifted him. He felt grateful for being alive, but also afraid of not measuring up to what was expected of him. That night, between dreams and awakenings, he heard clearly again, "Your life no longer belongs only to you." The echo of that phrase left him trembling. He opened his eyes and knew he couldn't keep ignoring that voice. Something inside him had to change. The question was, what? The days of rehabilitation became a ritual of small defeats and victories. Lucero, the physical therapist, marked modest goals. 10 steps with a walker, then 15. By the third lap of the hallway, Julian sweated as if he'd run a marathon. The pain was harsh, an animal that bit without letting go. "When you feel you can't, look at a fixed point," she advised him. "Here, we don't compete with anyone. We only move forward. I'm afraid of falling. I'll hold you up." And she did with firmness, without overdoing tenderness. That physical support brought an unexpected reflection. It also held his hope. By night, the hospital changed tone. Voices lowered, hallways smelled of freshly applied chlorine, and thoughts became louder than machines. Julian reviewed one by one the gestures of his family. Maria's lukewarm coffee, Diego's greasy fingers, Sophia's purple bracelet. Gratitude moved him, and at the same time it weighed on him like a debt. One early morning, a silent cry escaped him. Lucero, who was doing a late round, approached without asking. "Everything hurts," he said. "Healing hurts," she answered. "But pain is also telling you that you're alive." With each dawn, the routine repeated. Coughing exercises, measured breathing. Short steps, long pauses. The body learned its limits like old roads that had to be traced again. At times rage visited him. He wanted to get up suddenly, tear out the powerlessness, drive as before. Then reality sat him back down on the edge of the bed. In that swaying of forces, a certainty returned. He wasn't alone. Maybe he didn't understand everything. Maybe the world demanded more than he could give, but something or someone held his pulse when doubt became an emptiness. "Tomorrow," he promised himself, "I'll take 15 steps without stopping." The days of rehabilitation accumulated, and although Julian's body began responding with more firmness, his mind remained trapped in what he'd seen during the coma. He couldn't keep quiet about it. Every nurse who approached to change his floor, every patient who shared the hallway, eventually heard the same phrase, "I saw Jesus. He told me to come back." Reactions varied. Some looked at him with respect, as if his words were a miracle in themselves. Others smiled with discomfort, convinced he was speaking under the effect of medications. That diversity of looks intensified the day Dr. Martinez, a neurology specialist, decided to visit him. "Mr. Ramirez," he said in a professional tone while reviewing his file, "it's normal that after such severe trauma you experience visions. The brain, when deprived of oxygen, produces intense images, colors, voices. Many patients believe they've seen loved ones or religious figures." Julian listened attentively, but pressed his hands on the sheet. "It wasn't a hallucination, doctor. It felt real. The place, the smells, the voice, everything was too clear." Martinez adjusted his glasses and looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and caution. "I understand your conviction, but as a doctor, I must give you a physiological explanation. That doesn't mean your experience isn't valuable, just that we can interpret it differently." The conversation left Julian unsettled. When the doctor left, he turned toward Maria, who had listened to everything in silence. "Do you think it was just my brain?" he asked quietly. She breathed deeply before answering. "I think you were close to leaving, and if you come back with that certainty, it must have meaning. I don't care what science says." Maria's words comforted him, but the seed of doubt was already planted. In the next physical therapy session, he couldn't help commenting, "Lucero, Do you think what I saw was a dream? She smiled with serenity. I can't know. What I do know is that some patients find in those visions the strength to get up, and if that helps you, then it's real for you. That night, while trying to sleep among the noise of monitors, Julian reviewed again and again the words of Jesus. Your time hasn't ended. Go back and care for what you love. It couldn't be an illusion. The clarity of that voice pursued him like a living flame in his heart. Father Ignacio visited the next day. He sat beside him, holding a rosary in his hands. Son, I'm told you said something remarkable. Are you certain of what you saw? Certain, Father. It wasn't a dream. I saw him face to face. The priest looked at him with tenderness, though with some caution. Science will always seek explanations, and that's fine, but faith doesn't need proof. What matters is what you'll do with what you believe you lived. Julian fell silent. That was the question he didn't dare answer. What did that encounter mean for him? What should change now in his life? That same afternoon, while walking with the walker down the hallway, he overheard two nurses conversing. Behind him, that gentleman says he saw Jesus. Poor guy, must be the trauma. Or maybe he really did see him. Who knows? The voices stuck in his mind. He understood that the world was divided. Some would see a miracle, others a hallucination, and he would have to carry that duality. When Maria helped him lie down again, Julian looked at her with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Even if everyone thinks I'm crazy, I know what I lived, and I won't deny it. Maria squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. Then don't deny it. Hold on to that, because we'll need it. That night, Julian understood that his experience no longer belonged only to him. A debate had awakened that was only beginning. The news of Julian Ramirez's awakening didn't take long to leave the hospital corridors and reach the streets of Houston. First, it was a rumor among nurses and paramedics. Then someone mentioned it at the parish, and soon the story spread from mouth to mouth. The taxi driver in a coma says he saw Jesus. Neighbors began approaching the hospital, some with flowers, others with simple words of support. His room in intermediate care became a place of constant visits. There were those who entered with genuine faith, convinced that Julian was witness to a miracle. There were also the curious who looked at him as if he were a rarity. What affected him most was the impact the story began to have on his children. Sophia at school became the target of cruel bullying. One day she arrived at the hospital with red eyes from crying. Dad, they tell me you're a crazy man who made up Jesus for attention, she confessed with a broken voice. Julian felt a knot in his throat. He wanted to get up, protect her, but barely could move his legs without pain. He looked at her firmly and spoke with the greatest firmness he could gather. Daughter, don't let those words hurt you. I know what I saw. Even if no one else believes, I'll carry it with me to the end. She hugged him tightly, seeking in. That contact the security that the world outside denied her. Diego reacted differently. His reserved nature led him to face the situation in silence, but inside him burned a deep rage. One night, when alone with his father, he said quietly, If what you saw is true, you have to prove it. You can't just say it and leave us looking crazy. Julian listened with patience, understanding that his son's words were born from helplessness. It's not my job to convince the world, Diego. I can only tell what I lived. The rest isn't in my hands. In the neighborhood, opinions divided. Some considered him chosen. Others swore it was a hoax. The community's social media filled with comments, some supportive, others attacking without mercy. In the midst of that whirlwind, Father Ignacio visited again. He carried a calm that seemed unbreakable. Son, remember that prophets were also rejected. Faith makes people uncomfortable, and that's fine. Your mission isn't that everyone believes you, but that you remain faithful to what you lived. Julian clung to those words. He knew he couldn't control what people said, but he could control how he faced it. That night, listening to the murmur of voices in hospital corridors, he understood his life was no longer private. For better or worse, the community had placed him at the center of a conversation that surpassed him. The most difficult part was still to come.